Have you ever wondered what really happened in the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico during the 1860s and 70s? What horrors were so terrible that the government buried them in classified files for over a century? What did soldiers witness that made them refuse to speak about it even on their deathbeds? Before we dive into this disturbing chapter of American history, I need your help. First, comment below where you're watching from, and then please subscribe to this channel. We're working hard to bring you this secret content that mainstream history refuses to acknowledge, and your support keeps us going. Now, let's uncover what they've been hiding. The official records state that the Apache Wars lasted from 1849 to 1886, 37 years of conflict between the United States military and the Apache tribes of the Southwest. But what those records don't tell you is what really happened in the canyons, the hidden valleys, and the abandoned forts scattered across the Arizona territory. What they don't mention are the discoveries that made hardened cavalry officers weep like children, or the classified reports that vanished from military archives within days of being filed. It began in the spring of 1872, when Captain William Morrison and his company of the 3rd Cavalry received orders to pursue a band of Chiricahua Apache led by a warrior the soldiers called Shadow Walker. The name wasn't given out of respect. It was given out of fear. Shadow Walker had earned his reputation through a series of raids so perfectly executed that survivors claimed he and his warriors appeared and disappeared like smoke, leaving behind scenes that defied explanation. Morrison's orders were simple: track the band, engage if possible, and report back. What he found instead would haunt the United States Army for decades. The company rode out from Fort Bowie on the morning of April 19th. 47 men, seasoned veterans of the Civil War, confident in their training and their mission. They followed a trail of disturbed earth and broken branches into the Chiricahua Mountains, expecting a confrontation within days. What they didn't expect was the silence. Private James Hartford wrote in his diary, still preserved in the National Archives, "We rode for 3 days without hearing a single bird. No coyotes at night, no insects buzzing in the heat, just our horses' hooves on stone and the wind through the rocks. The men started talking less, started looking over their shoulders. Captain Morrison wouldn't admit it, but I could see it in his eyes. He felt it too. Something was watching us. Aji." On the 4th day, they found the first camp. It was abandoned, but the fires were still warm. Bedrolls laid out in perfect circles, cooking pots still steaming. But no people, not a single soul. The strangest part, according to Sergeant Daniel Pierce's official report, was the food. Fresh venison, still bloody, laid out on flat rocks. Dozens of portions, enough to feed 50 people. But not a bite had been taken. Morrison ordered his men to spread out and search the area. They found tracks leading in every direction, footprints that seemed to multiply and divide impossibly. Some led straight up cliff faces. Others ended abruptly in the middle of clearings, as if the people making them had simply vanished into the air. Then they found the first marker. It was a pile of stones, carefully arranged in a spiral pattern, each rock painted with symbols that none of the Apache scouts with the cavalry recognized. At the center of the spiral was a doll made from dried grass and animal sinew, its face a smooth blank surface, except for 2 holes where eyes should have been. The doll was positioned to face west, toward the setting sun, toward the deeper mountains. The Apache scouts refused to approach it. One of them, a man named Thomas Yellowhorse, who had served with the cavalry for 5 years, told Morrison through a translator, "This is not Apache. This is something older, something we do not speak of. We should leave this place." Morrison, to his credit or his doom, was a man of duty. He ordered the marker catalogued and photographed. The expedition's photographer, a civilian named Robert Chen, set up his equipment and captured the image. That photograph still exists, locked in a vault at the Smithsonian Institution. Those who have seen it report that the doll's empty eye holes seem to follow you, no matter where you stand. They rode deeper into the mountains, following a trail that grew increasingly bizarre. More camps, all abandoned, all with warm fires and untouched food. More markers, each one larger and more complex than the last. The spiral patterns grew into elaborate designs that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of the sun. The dolls multiplied, dozens of them, then hundreds, arranged in circles, in lines, in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. On the seventh day, they found the canyon. It wasn't marked on any map. A narrow split in a cliff face, hidden behind a rock fall that looked natural, but, upon closer inspection, had been carefully arranged. The entrance was barely wide enough for a horse. Morrison sent scouts ahead on foot. They returned within the hour, their faces pale, their hands shaking. "Sir," Corporal Marcus Webb reported, his voice barely above a whisper, "you need to see this." The canyon opened into a hidden valley, a mile long and half a mile wide, surrounded on all sides by sheer walls of red rock. It should have been a paradise, sheltered from the wind, with a stream running through its center and trees providing shade. Instead, it was a nightmare. The entire valley floor was covered in markers. Thousands of them, spiral patterns made from stones, bones, and materials the soldiers couldn't identify. And at the center of each spiral, a doll. But these weren't simple grass figures. These were elaborate constructions, some as tall as a man, made from materials that included human hair, pieces of uniforms, and objects that the soldiers recognized with growing horror as personal items reported missing from other cavalry expeditions over the past decade. A pocket watch belonging to Lieutenant Samuel Brooks, killed in an Apache ambush in 1868. A wedding ring identified as belonging to Captain Thomas Mitchell, who vanished with his entire patrol in 1870. A silver crucifix that had belonged to Chaplain Robert Stone, whose body was never recovered after an engagement near the Mexican border. The dolls weren't just markers. They were memorials, or trophies, or something worse that none of the men wanted to contemplate. Morrison ordered his men to document everything. They photographed, they sketched, they wrote detailed descriptions, and as they worked, they began to notice something that made their blood run cold. The dolls were positioned to face the far end of the valley, where the canyon wall rose highest, and carved into that wall, 100 feet up, was a massive spiral symbol, so large it could only be seen in its entirety from the valley floor. The carving was ancient, worn by centuries of wind and rain, but someone had recently painted it with something dark and red. Private Hartford wrote, "We could smell it from where we stood. Iron and copper. Blood. Fresh blood. Gallons of it must have been used to paint that symbol. But whose? We saw no bodies, no signs of struggle. Just that spiral, glistening in the afternoon sun, and the shadows it cast that seemed to move against the light." Morrison made the decision that would define the rest of his career. He ordered his men to camp in the valley overnight, to wait and watch, to see if whoever created this place would return. As the sun set, the temperature dropped rapidly, as it does in the desert. The soldiers built fires, posted guards, and tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But the valley wouldn't let them. As darkness fell, the dolls began to move. Not dramatically. Not in ways that could be easily proven or explained. Just subtle shifts. A head turned slightly. An arm raised a fraction of an inch. The wind, the men told themselves. Just the wind. But there was no wind. The valley was perfectly still, the air thick and oppressive despite the cold. Sergeant Pierce recorded the events of that night in meticulous detail, perhaps hoping that precision could ward off madness. At 2200 hours, Private Daniels reported movement near the perimeter. Investigation revealed nothing. At 2215, multiple sentries reported hearing voices, speaking in a language none recognized. No sources identified. At 2230, the fires began to burn differently. The flames turned blue-green at their tips, and the smoke smelled sweet, like flowers and decay. At 2245, we realized we were surrounded. They emerged from the shadows not as warriors, but as shapes. Human-sized but wrong somehow, their movements too fluid, their silhouettes lacking detail even in the firelight. The Apache scouts began to pray, old words in old languages, and some of the soldiers joined them, reciting the Lord's Prayer, the 23rd Psalm, anything that might offer protection. Captain Morrison stood and addressed the shapes, demanding identification, demanding communication. He received neither. Instead, the shapes began to circle the camp, moving in a spiral pattern that matched the markers on the ground. Round and round, drawing closer with each rotation, until they were close enough that the soldiers could see them clearly. They wore the faces of the dead. Not masks, not paint. The actual faces of soldiers who had died in the Apache Wars, stretched and worn like clothing over something else underneath. Lieutenant Brooks's face, preserved impossibly despite 4 years in the grave. Captain Mitchell's face, still bearing the scar he'd received at Gettysburg. Chaplain Stone's face, his expression frozen in the moment of his death, his eyes wide with a terror that had never faded. Private Hartford wrote, in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as his entry continued, "God forgive me. I recognized my brother Benjamin, who died at Shiloh in 1862. Died thousands of miles away. Died 10 years ago. But there he was, his face slack and dead on the head of something that wasn't him. Something that walked on 2 legs but moved like an insect. Something that opened its mouth and screamed with his voice." Morrison ordered his men to hold their fire. A decision that saved their lives, though at what cost, none of them could say. The shapes continued their spiral dance, drawing closer and closer, until they were mere feet from the terrified soldiers. And then they stopped, simply froze in place, as if waiting for something. From the far end of the valley, from the cliff face with its massive bloody spiral, came a sound, a drumbeat, slow and steady, like a heartbeat, but impossibly loud, echoing off the canyon walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. And with each beat of the drum, the dolls moved. All of them, thousands of them, turning their eyeless faces toward the soldiers. Morrison later wrote in his classified report, which wouldn't be declassified until 1998, "I have faced Confederate artillery. I have charged into massed rifle fire. I have seen men torn apart by cannon shot and watched friends die screaming in field hospitals. But nothing in war prepared me for the terror of that moment. The certainty that we had stumbled into something old and wrong, something that predated not just the Apache Wars or the United States, but perhaps civilization itself." The drumbeat continued through the night. The shapes remained frozen. The dolls stared, and the soldiers waited, unable to run, unable to fight, caught in a nightmare from which there seemed no escape. Some men prayed, some wept, some simply stared ahead. their minds retreating to safer places. As dawn approached, the drumbeat slowed. The shapes began to move backward, unwinding their spiral, retreating into the shadows from which they'd come. As the first rays of sunlight touched the valley floor, they vanished completely, leaving behind only the dolls and the markers and the terrible silence. Morrison ordered an immediate withdrawal. The men needed no encouragement. They broke camp in minutes, abandoning equipment, abandoning protocol, abandoning everything except their weapons and their horses. They rode out of that valley as if the devil himself was chasing them. And perhaps he was. They didn't stop until they reached Fort Bowie 3 days later. Of the 47 men who had ridden out, 43 returned. 4 soldiers were missing, including Private Hartford and Corporal Webb. No trace of them was ever found, despite extensive searches. Their names were added to the long list of men lost in the Apache Wars, their true fate known only to Captain Morrison and the officers who read his report. The Army's response was swift and absolute. All evidence from the expedition was confiscated. The photographs were sealed. The diaries and reports were classified. The surviving soldiers were transferred to different units, scattered across the country, forbidden from discussing what they'd seen under threat of court-martial. The hidden valley was marked on classified maps with a single notation: forbidden, do not enter. But the story didn't end there. It never does. Over the next 5 years, similar reports began to surface from across the Southwest. Different cavalry units, different locations, but always the same elements: hidden places, spiral markers, dolls made from impossible materials, and shapes that wore the faces of the dead. Each report was classified, each witness silenced, a pattern emerging that the Army couldn't ignore and couldn't explain. In 1874, Colonel Jonathan Pierce, no relation to Sergeant Daniel Pierce, was appointed to investigate what internal Army documents referred to as the spiral incidents. Pierce was a veteran of both the Mexican-American War and the Civil War, a man known for his rational mind and unwavering composure. His assignment was to determine whether the reports were the result of mass hysteria, Apache psychological warfare, or something else entirely. Pierce assembled a team of 12 specialists: geologists, anthropologists, a professor of Native American studies from Yale University, a medical doctor specializing in disorders of the mind, and 6 hand-picked soldiers who had no prior exposure to the previous incidents. They were given access to all classified materials, including Captain Morrison's report, the sealed photographs, and the fragments of diaries that had been confiscated. The professor, a man named Edward Thornton, became obsessed with the spiral symbols. He spent weeks comparing them to every known Native American marking, every documented religious symbol, every archaeological finding from pre-Columbian civilizations. He found similarities to dozens of cultures spanning thousands of years: spirals in Celtic tombs, spirals in Mayan temples, spirals carved into rocks by people who had vanished long before Europeans arrived in the Americas. But the spirals from the Hidden Valley were different. They incorporated elements that shouldn't have existed together, mathematical proportions that wouldn't be discovered until the 20th century, astronomical alignments that suggested knowledge of celestial mechanics far beyond what any Native American tribe should have possessed in the 19th century. Thornton wrote in his notes, "These are not the work of the Apache. They are not the work of any single culture. It is as if someone or something has been leaving these markers across human history, waiting for the right moment to be found." Pierce's expedition departed Fort Grant in September of 1874. They carried more equipment than Morrison's company had, including the latest photographic equipment, surveying tools, and weapons specifically requested by Pierce. repeating rifles, revolvers, and something unusual that raised eyebrows among the requisition officers, 20 gallons of kerosene, and 50 pounds of dynamite. When asked why, Pierce simply stated, "Insurance." They reached the hidden valley on the 16th day of their journey. The entrance was exactly where Morrison's maps indicated, but something had changed. The rock fall that had partially concealed it was gone, moved aside as if inviting entry. Fresh spiral markers lined the path, made from stones that were still warm to the touch despite the cool autumn air. Dr. Samuel Whitmore, the expedition's physician, took temperature readings as they entered. The ambient air was 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The stones in the markers measured 98.6 degrees, human body temperature. Whitmore checked his thermometer 3 times, convinced it was malfunctioning. It wasn't. The valley had grown. Or perhaps it had always been larger than Morrison reported, and the terror of that night had compressed his perception. Pierce's surveying team measured it at nearly 2 miles long and over a mile wide, dimensions that should have been impossible given the surrounding geography. When they compared their measurements to Morrison's official report, the discrepancy was undeniable. The valley was 4 times larger than it had been 2 years earlier. The dolls had multiplied. Where Morrison reported thousands, Pierce counted tens of thousands. They covered every available space, arranged in increasingly complex patterns that the expedition's mathematician, a young lieutenant named Richard Foster, recognized as fractals, geometric patterns that repeated at every scale. Foster wouldn't live long enough to explain how 19th-century Apache warriors could have understood advanced mathematical concepts that wouldn't be formally described until the 1970s. But the most disturbing change was the cliff face. The massive spiral symbol was still there, still painted in dried blood, but now it was surrounded by writing. Thousands of words carved into the stone in dozens of languages: Latin, Greek, Arabic, Sanskrit, Chinese characters, hieroglyphics, and among them, English. Professor Thornton spent 3 days documenting the inscriptions. He identified fragments from the Bible, passages from the Quran, verses from the Bhagavad Gita, excerpts from ancient Egyptian funerary texts. But they were wrong somehow, altered in ways that inverted their meanings. The 23rd Psalm rendered as a prayer to darkness rather than light. The Sermon on the Mount twisted into a celebration of suffering. Sacred texts from a dozen religions perverted into their opposites, and scattered among the religious texts were names, thousands of them, soldiers who had died in the Apache Wars, settlers who had vanished while crossing the territories, Spanish conquistadors from the 16th century, Mexican soldiers from the 1840s, names stretching back hundreds of years, all carved into this hidden cliff face in the middle of nowhere. Thornton found his own name among them, carved in perfect Victorian script, with a date below it, October 3rd, 1874. 2 weeks in the future. He showed the finding to Colonel Pierce, his hands trembling as he pointed to the carving. Pierce examined it silently, then ordered the entire cliff face photographed and documented. He didn't dismiss it. He didn't rationalize it. He simply added it to the growing body of evidence that something impossible was happening in this valley. That night, Pierce implemented strict security protocols. Guards posted every 50 feet around the perimeter. Constant patrols. No one allowed to wander alone. Fires built large and bright, creating pools of light that overlapped, leaving no shadows for things to hide in. And Pierce himself remained awake, walking among his men, offering reassurance and maintaining morale. The drums began at midnight. Not the single drum that Morrison had described, but dozens of them, hundreds of them, a cacophony of rhythms that should have been chaotic but instead formed a perfect mathematical pattern. And with the drums came the shapes. They were different this time, more solid, more defined. They didn't wear the faces of the dead, but instead appeared as warriors, perfect specimens of human form, their skin painted with spiral patterns that seemed to move in the firelight. They carried weapons, bows, spears, war clubs, but they didn't attack. They simply stood at the edge of the darkness, watching, waiting. Lieutenant Foster, the mathematician, began to count them. He reached 200 before he realized something that made his blood freeze. They were arranged in a pattern, a complex mathematical sequence that predicted their positions with perfect accuracy. He could calculate where each warrior would stand before his eyes found them. And as he worked through the equation, he realized it extended beyond what he could see. The pattern suggested thousands more warriors standing in the darkness beyond the firelight, invisible but present, waiting. He reported his findings to Pierce, showing the calculations in his field notebook. Pierce studied them for a long moment, then made a decision that would define the rest of the expedition. He ordered his men to hold their positions and their fire, and then he stepped forward, alone, into the space between the light and the darkness. "I am Colonel Jonathan Pierce of the United States Army," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent valley. "I come seeking understanding. If you wish to communicate, I am willing to listen." For a long moment, nothing happened. The drums continued their complex rhythm. The warriors remained motionless. And then, from the darkness beyond the firelight, came a voice. It spoke English, but with an accent that belonged to no known region. The words were perfectly enunciated, each syllable given equal weight, as if the speaker had learned the language from a book rather than from human conversation. "You seek to understand what you cannot comprehend. You seek to document what should not be remembered. You seek to control what exists beyond control." Pierce stood his ground. "Then help me understand. Show me what I need to see." The voice laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "You have already seen." Captain Morrison saw. The 43 who returned saw. But seeing and understanding are different things. You look at spirals and see patterns. We look at patterns and see spirals. You measure time in minutes and hours. We measure time in cycles and rotations. You believe you are hunters. You do not realize you are the hunted. "Who are you?" Pierce demanded. "What are you?" "We are the memory of what was. We are the promise of what will be. We are the space between breaths, the moment between heartbeats, the darkness that exists even in light. Your people call us many names: shadow walkers, spirit dancers, the hidden ones. But we are older than names, older than language. We were here before the Apache, before the Spanish, before the first humans crossed into this land, and we will be here long after the last human voice falls silent." Professor Thornton, unable to contain himself, shouted from the safety of the firelight. "What do you want? Why the markers? Why the dolls? Why take the faces of the dead?" The voice shifted direction, now seeming to come from directly behind Thornton, though nothing was visible there. "We do not take. We preserve. Every face you saw was given willingly, in the moment of transition, when the spirit leaves and the flesh remains. We preserve them so they are not forgotten. We mark the land so the pattern continues. We prepare for the time when the spiral completes and what was separated becomes one again." Dr. Whitmore, the physician, asked the question they all feared to voice. The date on Professor Thornton's name. October 3rd. What happens on October 3rd? The laughter came again, now from multiple directions simultaneously. Nothing happens. Everything happens. The pattern demands balance. A name is carved. A choice is made. Free will exists even in prophecy. Professor Thornton can choose to leave this valley and live. Or he can choose to stay and understand. Both futures exist until the choice collapses them into one. Pierce made a command decision. We're leaving. Now. Everyone pack essential equipment only. We move in 5 minutes. But as his men scrambled to break camp, the warriors in the darkness moved closer. Not threatening, not attacking, simply closing the distance, tightening the circle. The firelight seemed to dim, despite the flames burning as bright as before, as if the darkness itself was growing stronger. "You cannot leave," the voice said, and now it came from everywhere and nowhere. "Not all of you. The pattern demands balance. 4 names are carved for Captain Morrison's expedition. 4 soldiers never returned. 12 names are carved for your expedition, Colonel. 12 names with 12 dates. Some close, some far, but all inevitable." Pierce drew his revolver, not pointing it at anything specific, simply holding it as a talisman against the impossible. "I don't believe in inevitability. My men and I are leaving this valley, and nothing is going to stop us." "Belief is irrelevant," the voice replied. "Gravity does not require belief to function. The sun does not require belief to rise, and the pattern does not require belief to continue. But we are not cruel. We offer a trade. Knowledge for freedom. Stay 1 more night. Listen to what we teach. And in the morning, those who wish to leave may leave. But those who truly understand will choose to stay." Pierce wanted to refuse. Every instinct told him to order his men to fight their way out, if necessary, to shoot anything that moved, to burn the valley with the kerosene, and collapse the entrance with the dynamite. But he was also a man of science, a man who sought understanding even in the face of terror. And some part of him, some deep curiosity that had driven him to volunteer for this assignment in the first place, wanted to know. "1 night," he agreed. "You talk, we listen, and then we leave." The warriors stepped back, widening their circle. The drums shifted to a slower, more hypnotic rhythm. And from the cliff face, from the massive spiral painted in blood, figures began to emerge. Not warriors this time, but something else. Something that had never been human. They were tall, impossibly tall. Their bodies stretched and elongated like shadows cast by a setting sun. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were smooth and featureless, except for eyes that reflected the firelight like mirrors. They moved with a grace that defied physics, each step flowing into the next without the normal rhythm of human walking. Lieutenant Foster, the mathematician, began to hyperventilate as he watched them approach. "The proportions," he gasped. "The ratios. They're wrong. They can't exist in 3-dimensional space. They're like they're projections from somewhere else. Something higher." The beings arranged themselves around the expedition's camp. And when they spoke in unison, their voices overlapping to create harmonics that resonated in the soldiers' chests, in their bones, in their skulls. And they told a story. They spoke of a time before time when the world was different, when the boundaries between what humans called the physical and the spiritual were thinner. They spoke of their kind, beings of pure thought and pattern, who existed in the spaces between existence. They spoke of how they had walked among the first humans, teaching them to see patterns, to understand cycles, to recognize the spirals that connected all things. But humanity grew afraid. Afraid of what they didn't understand. Afraid of beings that existed beyond their comprehension. And so humanity forgot, deliberately, collectively, pushing the knowledge into myths and legends, transforming the teachers into monsters, the guides into demons. We did not leave, the beings said. We simply stopped revealing ourselves. We retreated to the hidden places, the forgotten valleys, the spaces that exist in the cracks of your reality. And we waited. We maintained the markers. We preserved the knowledge. We prepared for the time when humanity would be ready to remember. Professor Thornton, overcome with academic fervor despite his terror, asked, "Why now? Why reveal yourselves to us? Why leave the markers where soldiers and settlers can find them?" "Because the cycle is ending," the beings replied. "The great spiral is completing its rotation. In your terms, in your measurements of time, the world is approaching a threshold, a moment of transition when the old patterns will either renew or collapse. We leave the markers to prepare those who can understand, to warn those who would listen, and to preserve the memory of what was, so that what comes next carries the knowledge forward." "What comes next?" Pierce asked, his voice steady despite the fear he felt. "What happens when the spiral completes?" The beings turned their mirror eyes toward him, and in those reflections, Pierce saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He saw cities burning. He saw machines of war beyond anything his century could imagine. He saw weapons that could turn entire cities to ash in moments. He saw humanity reaching heights of achievement and depths of horror that seemed impossible. And he saw, at the end of it all, the spiral beginning again. "Change," the beings said simply. "Transformation. The death of one age and the birth of another. As it has happened before. As it will happen again. The pattern continues. The spiral turns. And those who understand will survive to carry the knowledge forward." Dr. Whitmore, his medical mind seeking rational explanation, asked, "Are you saying humanity will destroy itself? Is that what you're predicting?" "We do not predict. We observe patterns. Water flows downhill. Fire burns. And intelligent species that forget the spiral eventually consume themselves. But consumption is not extinction. From the ashes, new growth. From destruction, new creation. The pattern continues." The beings spoke through the night, sharing knowledge that the expedition members struggled to comprehend. They spoke of mathematics that existed beyond human understanding, of physics that operated on principles yet to be discovered, of histories that contradicted every accepted account. They showed the soldiers visions, images projected directly into their minds, of ancient civilizations that rose and fell leaving no trace, of technologies that seemed like magic, of moments in human history when the world balanced on the edge of transformation. And they spoke of the Apache. The real Apache, not the beings themselves, but the human tribes that inhabited these lands. They spoke with respect, with admiration, for a people who had maintained their connection to the old knowledge, who still understood the importance of the spiral, who recognized that the land held memories and wisdom that civilization tried to forget. "The Apache call us by many names," the beings explained. "Mountain spirits, crown dancers, the guardians of the peaks. They understand that we are not enemies. We are not friends. We simply are. We exist in the spaces between, maintaining the pattern, preserving the knowledge. And when they paint their faces and dance their dances, they are not worshipping us. They are remembering, connecting to the spiral, maintaining the balance." As dawn approached, The beings began to fade, not walking away, but simply becoming less solid, less present, as if the morning light was dissolving them back into whatever dimension they truly inhabited. Before they vanished completely, they left the expedition with a warning and a choice. 12 names are carved, they said. 12 dates recorded. But the future is not fixed. Free will exists within pattern. Each of you can choose. Return to your fortresses and your cities. Write your reports. Speak your truths. And watch as your superiors declare you mad, as your evidence is sealed, as your warnings are ignored. Or stay. Learn. Become the keepers of knowledge. Join the chain of memory that stretches back to the first humans and forward to the last. Colonel Pierce gathered his men as the sun rose over the valley. He looked at each face, seeing the fear, the confusion, the wonder, the terror, all mixed together in expressions that would have seemed impossible just days before. And he asked them, one by one, what they chose. 8 men chose to leave. They packed their equipment, destroyed their notes and photographs as the beings had predicted their superiors would do anyway, and rode out of the valley without looking back. They returned to Fort Grant, reported that the expedition found nothing of significance, and requested transfers to different posts. Within a year, all 8 were stationed at distant locations, far from Arizona, far from New Mexico, far from anything that might remind them of what they'd seen. 4 men chose to stay. Professor Thornton, whose carved name had a date just days away. Lieutenant Foster, the mathematician who had glimpsed equations that wouldn't be discovered for a century. Dr. Whitmore, the physician who wanted to understand the medical implications of what they'd witnessed, and a young private named Michael Dawson, who had said nothing during the entire night, but whose eyes showed a hunger for knowledge that transcended fear. Colonel Pierce was the last to choose. He stood at the valley entrance, 1 foot on the path out, 1 foot on the path deeper in, embodying the choice that had been offered, and then he did something that would never appear in any official record. He turned his horse around and rode back to join the 4 who had stayed. The 8 who left made it back to Fort Grant. They filed their reports. They were debriefed, declared suffering from exposure and exhaustion, and quickly reassigned. Their reports were sealed, their evidence confiscated, their stories forgotten. Almost. Because Colonel Pierce had anticipated this. Before entering the valley the second time, he had written a detailed account of everything they'd discovered and sent it to a trusted friend, a journalist in Washington named Samuel Hartley. The account was sealed with instructions. If Pierce didn't return within 6 months, publish everything. 6 months passed. Pierce didn't return. Hartley attempted to publish the account in every major newspaper in the country. All refused, citing impossibility, lack of corroboration, or direct pressure from military authorities. Finally, a small academic journal agreed to run excerpts, heavily edited, under the title Unusual Geological and Anthropological Phenomena in the American Southwest. The article caused a minor stir in academic circles, mostly dismissed as sensationalized fiction. But a few people took notice. Other soldiers who had experienced similar events, settlers who had found markers, Apache elders who recognized the descriptions. A network began to form quietly, secretly, of people who knew the truth, and the disappearances continued. Over the next decade, dozens of soldiers, settlers, and explorers vanished in the territories of Arizona and New Mexico. Some names appeared later, carved into cliff faces in hidden valleys. Others simply ceased to exist, as if they had stepped through a doorway and closed it behind them. The Army responded by declaring certain areas off-limits, restricted zones with no official explanation. Maps were redrawn to avoid showing specific valleys and canyons. Official records were altered to eliminate references to the spiral incidents. And slowly, methodically, the government tried to erase any evidence that something impossible had happened in the Southwest. But they couldn't erase everything. In 1878, a rancher named Thomas Everett was exploring his newly acquired land in southern Arizona when he found a valley matching descriptions from the sealed reports. He found the markers, the dolls, the carved names, and he found something else. A journal, carefully preserved in a waterproof case, written in a hand identified later as Professor Thornton's. The journal described the 4 years Thornton spent in the valley after Pierce's expedition. It detailed lessons learned from the beings, mathematical principles that wouldn't be discovered until the 20th century, observations about the nature of reality that sounded like science fiction. And it ended with an entry dated October 3rd, 1874, the date that had been carved next to his name. "Today I understand," Thornton wrote. "The date was not my death. It was my transformation. The moment I stopped being a professor, collecting data, and became a student, learning truth. The beings were right. Free will exists within pattern. I chose to stay. I chose to learn. And now I choose to go further. There are deeper valleys, older markers, greater spirals. I am leaving this journal for whoever finds it, not as a warning, but as an invitation. The pattern continues. The spiral turns, and there is always room for those brave enough to seek understanding rather than comfort." The journal ended there. Thomas Everett, the rancher who found it, brought it to authorities in Tucson, who immediately confiscated it and added it to the growing collection of sealed evidence. But Everett had read it first, and he had made copies. Those copies circulated quietly through academic and military circles, sparking debates that were quickly suppressed. Some called it an elaborate hoax. Others believed it was the ravings of a man driven mad by the desert. But a few recognized it for what it was, evidence of something that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. In 1880, Major General George Crook, one of the most successful commanders in the Apache Wars, filed a classified report that wouldn't be declassified until 2003. In it, he described an encounter his forces had with what he called non-Apache entities during a campaign in the White Mountains. His description matched the beings from Pierce's expedition almost perfectly. But more disturbing was his conclusion. "I have spent 7 years fighting the Apache," Crook wrote. "I have learned to respect them as warriors, to understand their tactics, to predict their movements. But these encounters, these phenomena we have experienced in certain locations, have taught me something that troubles me deeply. We are not fighting for control of this territory. We are fighting in ignorance of what truly controls it. The Apache know this. They have always known it. They fight us, yes, but they also avoid certain places, respect certain boundaries, maintain certain traditions that keep them safe from something we cannot even acknowledge exists. We call them savages, but in this matter, they possess wisdom we lack." Crook's report led to a secret initiative within the War Department. A small group of officers and civilian specialists were tasked with investigating the phenomenon across all territories where similar incidents had been reported. They called themselves the Spiral Commission, though no official record of their formation exists. Their mission: to map the hidden valleys, to document the markers, to understand the pattern. What they discovered terrified them. The spirals weren't limited to Arizona and New Mexico. They appeared across the entire Southwest, stretching from Texas to California, from Colorado to the Mexican border. Dozens of hidden valleys, hundreds of marker sites, thousands of carved names, some dating back to the 16th century Spanish explorations, and at each site, evidence of the beings, the entities, the things that existed in the spaces between reality. But more disturbing was the pattern itself. When the Spiral Commission mapped all the locations, connecting them with lines, a massive design emerged. A spiral, hundreds of miles across, centered on a location in northern New Mexico that the Apache called the Place of Emergence, the mythical location where their ancestors had first entered this world. In 1882, the Spiral Commission sent an expedition to the center of the pattern. 20 men, the best trained, the most experienced, equipped with the latest weapons and technology. They were led by Captain James Richardson, a veteran of 15 years of frontier service, a man who had read all the classified reports and still volunteered for the mission. They reached the Place of Emergence on June 17, 1882. Their last telegram, sent from a relay station 50 miles south, reported that they had found the location and were preparing to investigate. They were never heard from again. No trace of them was ever found. No bodies, no equipment, no evidence they had ever existed except for that final telegram, still preserved in the National Archives. The Spiral Commission was quietly dissolved. Their findings were sealed under the highest classification, and the government made a decision that would shape policy for the next century. Some things were better left unexplored. Some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue, but the spirals didn't stop. Throughout the 1880s, as the Apache Wars wound down and the last free Apache bands surrendered, reports continued to surface. Soldiers found markers on routine patrols. Settlers discovered hidden valleys while searching for lost livestock. And occasionally, people vanished, their names sometimes appearing later carved into remote cliff faces. In 1886, the Apache warrior Geronimo surrendered for the final time, ending the official Apache Wars. In his later years, living as a prisoner of war, he gave occasional interviews about his experiences. In one, recorded by an anthropologist named Morris Oppler in 1940, Geronimo spoke about the mountain spirits, the beings the Apache called Gan. "The white men think the Gan are just our myths," Geronimo said through a translator. "They think we paint our faces and dance to worship imaginary spirits. But the Gan are real. They have always been real. They live in the mountains, in the hidden places, and they are neither good nor evil. They simply are. We respect them. We honor them. We maintain the old ways so we remember how to coexist with them. The white men do not understand this. They build where they should not build. They disturb what should not be disturbed. And the Gan respond, not with anger but with truth, showing the white men what they refuse to see." When asked what truth the Gan showed, Geronimo smiled sadly. That the world is larger than they believe. That there are powers older than their God. That knowledge can be more terrible than ignorance. The white men think they conquered the Apache, but the Apache never tried to conquer the land. We lived with it. We understood that some victories are defeats in disguise. The interviewer pressed for more details, but Geronimo would say nothing further on the subject. He died in 1909, taking his knowledge to the grave. But his words were recorded, filed away in academic archives, and largely forgotten. Until 1947, when something happened that brought renewed attention to the old spiral incidents. Near Roswell, New Mexico, an object crashed on a ranch. The official explanation changed multiple times, from a weather balloon to a classified project to a routine equipment failure. But investigators noticed something odd. The crash site was less than 30 miles from one of the locations mapped by the Spiral Commission 65 years earlier. And at the crash site, among the debris, military personnel reported finding markers. Spiral patterns made from materials that weren't metal, weren't rock, weren't anything they could identify. The markers were photographed, collected, and immediately classified. The photographs still exist, locked in vaults that few people know about. In the 1960s, during the height of the Cold War, the government launched a classified project called Operation Deep Pattern. Using newly developed computer technology, they attempted to map and analyze all known spiral sites across the Southwest. What they found both amazed and terrified them. The pattern wasn't random. It was mathematical, precise, and it was growing. New markers were appearing, following the same geometric rules as the old ones, expanding the spiral outward in a predictable sequence. The project's final report, declassified in 2011 due to a Freedom of Information Act request, concluded with a recommendation that still sends chills through researchers who read it. Continued monitoring advised. Pattern expansion suggests completion date approximately 2035 to 2045. Nature of completion event unknown. Recommend preparation of contingency protocols. What happens when the spiral completes? No one knows. The beings that Captain Morrison's men encountered spoke of transformation, of cycles ending and beginning. Professor Thornton's journal mentioned deeper valleys, older markers, greater spirals. And General Crook warned that the Apache possessed wisdom about coexisting with powers that civilization refused to acknowledge. Today, in the 21st century, the hidden valleys still exist. Many are now within protected wilderness areas, officially off-limits due to environmental regulations or sacred site designations. But hikers occasionally report finding markers, spiral patterns made from stones that are warm to the touch. And occasionally, people still vanish in the Southwest deserts, their disappearances attributed to exposure, animal attacks, or simple misadventure. But some researchers know better. Some have accessed the classified files, read the old reports, seen the photographs that were never meant to be public. And they watch the dates, following the mathematical pattern established by Operation Deep Pattern, counting down to the moment when the spiral completes, and something changes. The names are still being carved. New names, modern names, appearing on cliff faces in locations that require days of hiking to reach. Names of people who vanished, or people who made the choice that Colonel Pierce and Professor Thornton made, stepping away from civilization and into understanding. And deep in the most restricted areas, where military personnel occasionally patrol and immediately report anything unusual, the markers continue to appear. The dolls continue to multiply. And on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the desert is silent, those who dare to watch report seeing shapes moving in spiral patterns, dancing to drums that no human plays. The Apache, or at least those who maintain the old traditions, still perform their crown dances, still paint their faces with the symbols that honor the mountain spirits. And they still avoid certain places, respect certain boundaries, maintain certain traditions that they tell outsiders are just cultural heritage. But among themselves, in languages that few white people speak, they tell the truth. The gone are still there, the beings in the hidden places, the entities that exist in the spaces between, and they are still waiting, still teaching those who have the courage to learn, still preparing for the moment when the pattern completes and the world transforms into whatever comes next. What happened in the Apache Wars was never just about territory or sovereignty or the clash of civilizations. It was humanity stumbling into a truth older than history, encountering powers that existed before the first human footprint marked the soil of this continent. Some understood and adapted. Some fought and died. And some chose a third path, stepping into the spiral and becoming something else entirely. The government files remain sealed. The evidence remains classified. The truth remains hidden behind layers of denial and obfuscation. But the pattern continues. The spiral grows. And those who know watch the calendar, counting down to a date that might bring nothing or might bring everything. Perhaps the Apache were never truly conquered. Perhaps they simply chose to maintain their connection to powers that the conquerors couldn't even acknowledge existed. Perhaps the real war was never between cavalry and warriors, but between those who accepted the limits of human understanding and those who dared to push beyond. In the end, we are left with questions that have no comfortable answers. Were the beings real or mass hallucination? Were the spirals evidence of ancient knowledge or elaborate hoaxes? Did men like Colonel Pierce and Professor Thornton find enlightenment or madness in those hidden valleys? And most disturbing of all, what happens when the pattern completes and the transformation they spoke of finally arrives? The carved names suggest we won't have to wait much longer to find out. The mathematical projections point to dates within our lifetime, and the markers keep appearing, following their ancient pattern, building toward a conclusion that has been centuries in the making. If you find yourself in the deserts of Arizona or New Mexico, if you stumble upon a hidden valley or a spiral pattern made from warm stones, remember the warnings of those who came before. Remember Captain Morrison's terror, Professor Thornton's choice, General Crook's wisdom, and Geronimo's sad smile. Remember that knowledge can be more terrible than ignorance, and that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And remember this: in a world that claims to be fully mapped, fully explored, fully understood, there are still hidden places, still forbidden valleys, still spirals carved into cliff faces by hands that might not be entirely human. The Apache Wars ended over a century ago, but whatever those wars touched, whatever they awakened or revealed, is still out there, still waiting, still watching, still preparing for the day when the spiral completes. In these dark times, when mysteries seem to multiply and certainties crumble, perhaps the greatest wisdom is not found in documents and evidence, but in faith. The beings in the valleys spoke of patterns and cycles, of transformations beyond human control. But there is a pattern older and more powerful than any spiral, a truth that transcends all earthly mysteries. It is found in the words of Jesus Christ, who said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Whatever waits in the hidden valleys, whatever entities exist in the spaces between reality, they are part of creation, subject to the same divine authority that governs all existence. The spirals may turn, the patterns may evolve, but above all cycles and transformations stands the eternal God, unchanging and all-powerful. If the stories told here disturb you, if the mysteries presented seem overwhelming, take comfort in knowing that no power on earth or beyond it exceeds the sovereignty of the Creator. The soldiers who faced impossible horrors in those valleys needed faith as much as courage. And we, facing uncertainties in our own time, need that same anchor of belief. Turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ. In a world full of questions without answers, of patterns we cannot fully comprehend, of transformations we cannot predict, faith offers something that no amount of knowledge can provide: the assurance that whatever comes, whatever changes, whatever mysteries unfold, we are never alone, never abandoned, never beyond the reach of divine grace. The spiral may complete, the pattern may transform, but the love of God endures forever, unchanging, eternal. The one truth that no hidden valley can obscure, and no ancient power can diminish. Hold to that. Believe in that. And whatever mysteries the future reveals, face them not in fear, but in faith. May God bless you and keep you. May you find peace in His presence and strength in His word. And may you remember always that the greatest mystery has already been revealed, the greatest pattern already completed, in the sacrifice and resurrection of Jesus Christ our Lord.